This is the fourth and last day of the British Postgraduate Philosophy Association annual conference. It's been organized in association with Minorities and Philosophy and is virtually hosted by the University of Manchester. This year's theme, as you might already know, is about radical philosophy. I'm Carlo. I'll be chairing today's session, and Shudo will help me later on with the panel discussion. Before starting, just in case anyone needs to leave sooner, and this is the last day, I would really like to thank you all our speakers and the audience. You've been really wonderful. And yeah, the schedule today is structured just as it was yesterday. So we will have the keynote presentation, then just one graduate presentation, followed by the panel discussion, which will be devoted to the topic of the scope and prospect of fusion and comparative philosophy. Okay, hoping that you are all excited as I am by today's lineup. So I'll move on and present today's keynote speaker, Professor Hans-Johann Glock. Professor Glock received his doctoral degree at the University of Oxford and is now full professor and head of department at the University of Zurich. His research interests include, but are not limited to, the philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and the history of analytic philosophy. And he has been publishing extensively in each of these fields. Just to mention a couple of publications that are particularly relevant to today's talk. There is the monograph he published in 2008 with Cambridge University Press, entitled "What is Analytic Philosophy?" The article which appeared in Mind, again in 2008, Analytic Philosophy and History, a Mismatch, and a book he edited in 1997 with the title of The Rise of Analytic Philosophy. So the title of his presentation today will be The Analytic Continental Divide, a Case of Faultless Disagreement. As usually, will be a 45 minutes question talk, and then we're going to have a 5 minutes break before the Q&A. So without taking any more time, please join me in welcoming Professor Glock.
Thank you very much for the invitation. By way, I guess, of apologies, I will say that usually I prepare my talks while traveling to, the conference destination, and this has not been possible this time round, which I regret. You will regret that I haven't been able to prepare this properly. The result is that this is perhaps even more straight-laced analytic meta-philosophy than I had originally intended. Yeah, so there's more meta-philosophy in it and less comparative philosophy, although I hope that you'll find it moderately useful in thinking about differences between types of philosophy. I'll omit the first subject that was mentioned in my abstract, namely peer disagreement. I let you off on grounds of good behavior, I suppose. So this is my motto. Every day I ask myself those age-old questions. Who am I? Where am I? Why am I here? That, my friend, is philosophy. Sounds more like amnesia. And I've often felt this way, especially, but not exclusively, when it comes to thinking about the nature of philosophy. So here's my preview. I'll just mention disagreement as a hot topic, and this is one point at which I'll venture into some wider cultural context. Then I'll focus on philosophical disagreement and its complex connection to metaphilosophical disagreement. I will then diagnose a circularity in any attempt to really establish what the nature of philosophy, its aims and proper methods are. Roughly speaking, the nature of philosophy is a philosophical problem. It can only be tackled by philosophical methods. So therefore, the methods rely on philosophical views. The views rely on philosophical methods. So it seems we are stuck. And I'll, promote what I think is a rather moderate conception of metaphilosophical debate. I will, in this context, attack what I call the myth of mere method, the idea that you can somehow engage in philosophizing in a presuppositionless manner. Just that there's a kind of method which doesn't in turn rely on a certain philosophical outlook. Then I'll look at the analytic continental split. On the analytic side, I will rely on the aforementioned book. On the continental side, I will, refer mainly to Chase and Reynolds, who've written a book about the contrast between analytic and continental philosophy. Then I will raise the question of whether this is really a case of faultless disagreement. And I'll, give two reasons for thinking that it isn't. But at the end, I think I will try to suggest that if you don't see it in terms of a contrast between either doctrines, nor in terms of a contrast between one style which sets a store by clarity and another one which doesn't, then there may be room for thinking that with these, and this can be extended to other ways of philosophizing, both of these are legitimate intellectual pursuits. Let me just, by way of, caution, say that I will assume that there is such a thing as Western philosophy. So anybody who hasn't got time for such orthodoxies, can leave the Zoom session now. But I think I've learned from Wittgenstein that the fact that a distinction allows of borderline cases and is context dependent and rather more complicated than we used to think is not per se a reason to abandon it entirely. So, I will, realizing that this is contested territory, I will make that assumption. Okay. Oops. Okay. Disagreement as a hot topic. Now, the subject of disagreement is, very en vogue in philosophy these days. I mean, not just in meta-ethics or political philosophy, but also in epistemology, aesthetics, meta-philosophy. You name it, there's disagreement. This, to me, suggests that our age is indeed one of diversity and pluralism. But that diversity is not always of the ideal kind. Yeah, I mean, I think many people these days are keen to emphasize diversity. I think there's also room for thinking about ways in which diverse factions, diverse ideals, diverse paradigms, diverse groups can come to talk to each other and reach some kind of consensus. So my talk acknowledges the importance of agonistic diversity while striving to overcome it, and striving to overcome it through, reasonably clear and rational argument. So, that's the angle I'm coming from. Yes, we must acknowledge diversity, but we should also think about ways of coming to terms. Okay, and into my special topic here is diversity and disagreement in philosophy, and I will approach it through talking about the connections between philosophical and metaphilosophical diversity, and more specifically between philosophical disputes and metaphilosophical disputes. Okay, philosophical disagreement. At least since Kant, there has been a pervasive suspicion that philosophy is inherently incapable of making progress. Why? Because philosophical disputes are irresolvable. And both of these features, lack of progress and these interminable debates, are often explained by reference to the fact that philosophical problems are more fundamental and hence less tractable than those in other areas, notably those in natural science. But you have to ask yourself, how special is philosophy here? In what sense, if any, is philosophy simply more fundamental than other subjects? Well, it seems to me that's something we like to tell ourselves, but physics can at least can lay claim to be just as basic, certainly when it comes to investigating the constituents and features of reality. And formal logic and mathematics can at least can lay claim to being at least as fundamental in that they are topic neutral. Their considerations apply to just about any topic. Finally, it seems that philosophy is not that special in being subject to fundamental controversies. There are opposing views within just about any area of inquiry, however factual or scientific it may be. Oops. Oops. What's happened now? Huh? And yet, in the special sciences, these disputes are eventually settled. If you believe that the Earth is flat or that pi is rational, you will be disbarred from serious astronomy or mathematics. Not to mention recent conspiracy, well, they call them theories, but that's, I think, doing them too much of an honor. So, these views are around, but, they are simply not counted as science or serious science. But even in the sciences, the demarcation is not always clear-cut. So, are Lysenkoism or intelligent design theories simply unscientific? Or are they bad, ideologically or politically motivated science? These questions are hard to decide, but one thing is clear: not even the kind of loose catharsis that keeps out flat earthers from astronomy has ever taken place in philosophy. There's literally no position on any vaguely philosophical topic that has not been adopted by someone generally regarded as a philosopher. That, incidentally, is one reason why excluding things like non-Western philosophies or world philosophies, whether African modes of thought like Ujamaa, ab initio, is completely out of sync with the kind of pluralism we find in Western philosophy. Okay, let me just, can I do that? I think I'll have to do it this way. Yeah. Okay, so now I turn to metaphilosophical disputes. Sometimes the persistence of philosophical disagreements is explained not by reference to philosophy being more fundamental, but by reference to their link with metaphilosophical conflicts about the proper aims, methods, and results of philosophy. Some people, for instance, Josidoro, have maintained that philosophical disputes are ipso facto methodological or metaphilosophical. Or at least that when you pursue a philosophical dispute to the bitter end, when both sides dig in their heels, in a philosophical dispute, it will eventually turn out that they just have contrasting approaches to the subject itself. Now, I think this diagnosis contains at least two kernels of truth. First, it is true that methodological or metaphilosophical conflicts are more fundamental and irreconcilable. for the simple reason because they concern the kind of common ground that is usually taken for granted in doctrinal disputes. What are the right problems to tackle? Should we even, if you think that, you're a straight-laced analytic philosopher, then you think, well, yeah, let's have more and more reflections on Gettier cases or, trolley cases. And that's just the thing to do. But, you may also think that both Gettier problems and trolley cases are utterly misleading in epistemology and ethics, respectively. How should they be tackled, right? If you have two formal semanticists around the table, then that's easier than if you have a formal semanticist and a kind of renegade Wittgensteinian like me. What counts as a successful solution? It will also be in dispute. Oops. And what can we expect, from employing our methods in an optimal fashion? How far can they take us? And this is why revolutionaries down the ages have hoped that the introduction of a novel and bulletproof method will put an end to legitimate philosophical dispute. The way to end philosophical dispute is to introduce novel methods. And that's an idea, which you find obviously in people like Aristotle or Descartes or Kant, perhaps also, in people like Anscombe and her followers. And so I think if that aspiration could be implemented, then there would no longer be any faultless disagreement on basic philosophical topics. We would have a method for tackling these topics. And if you then continue to disagree, you're at fault, just as a mathematician is at fault if she doesn't recognize a valid proof, a sound proof, I should say. Okay, now, but there's another reason why, philosophical disputes are pretty intractable on account of their connection with metaphilosophy. And this is that metaphilosophy is simply a part of philosophy. The label notwithstanding, metaphilosophy is not a distinct higher order discipline. It's an integral part of philosophy itself. This integral conception of metaphilosophy is in line, I think, with tradition, and it's also shared by the current majority of philosophers. It's not incontestable, incidentally, but I think this is one point on which I'm very much part of the mainstream. I think there are external investigations of philosophy, sociology of knowledge, springs to mind, and they're extremely interesting, but I think they're philosophically entirely barren. That is a controversial claim, I hope. But see. Oops. Okay. So now, if what I said so far is correct, then I think we face a circularity problem. Oops. Now, the natural sciences have to establish their own fields and methods no less than philosophy. However, they have done so in a way which has become increasingly less controversial, and disputes about the nature of the subject no longer play any significant role. Even in times of scientific revolutions, like the transition from classic to relativistic and quantum mechanics, scientific debates do not usually concern questions like what is astronomy? An introduction to astronomy will not be a survey of warring schools on this issue, as it might well be in philosophy. I'm not sure that would be a good way of introducing philosophy, but it's certainly quite a common one. Why is philosophy particularly problematic? Well, it lacks a distinctive subject matter. I mean, I'm not, Dummett would say philosophy, deals with thoughts, and that's the end of the matter, but I am not such a pious Phrygian. And someone who has a different view about the subject matter of a particular science is simply not engaged in that particular field. And although there is methodological debate during scientific revolutions, somebody who holds radically deviant methodological views, i.e. who totally disregards observation and experiment in favor of, e.g., aesthetic or political considerations, simply ceases to be a scientist. That is, again, controversial. Some people would say string theory. People just believe in that because it's so beautiful, mathematically speaking. But, there's not a shred of empirical evidence. But, I think by and large, this holds in the sciences. Okay, so in contrast, and this is really just recapping, the range of intellectual activities which are still called philosophy is just very wide. There are philosophers who would maintain, for instance, that philosophy should strive neither for knowledge or cogency of argument, but for beauty, spiritual inspiration, or political relevance. And this, of course, we will, as you will have suspected, holds in particular of continental philosophers. These are bona fide philosophers, but their aims may be different. Now, picking up on a text by Ryle, whether anyone who consistently avoids arguments of any kind should qualify as a philosopher is a moot point. But there certainly are philosophers who would deny Ryle's claim that the principles of any reputable philosophical ism are established and only established by philosophical argument, right? I mean, I'm firmly of Ryle's opinion on this matter, but I don't think that this is something that all bona fide philosophers would subscribe to. In fact, I know not all do subscribe to it. Now, the threat of circularity notwithstanding, oh God, something has gone wrong here. I think one of my has disappeared. Perhaps this is, let me just quickly, can I just quickly stop the sharing? If something has gone wrong here.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I'll stop share and have a quick look at it will give you a breather. What is going on? Okay. Okay, sorry. Oops. Oh, God. Okay, I'll make do with this. Okay. So, all right. So let me just open, preferably the right. No. All right. Okay. So now. Yeah. So if this is correct, if there's no agreement across bona fide philosophy, even on methods, then we seem to face a circularity problem. The nature of philosophy and its proper methods are themselves contested philosophical issues, right? People hold different views on this, and these are differences within philosophy. You can't solve this by recourse to a meta level. So these different conceptions of philosophy themselves rest on controversial philosophical views. I mean, this is perhaps obvious to someone like me who has been working on Wittgenstein for a long time. Wittgenstein's idea that philosophical problems, events, conceptual confusions rest on certain ideas about what it distinguishes a priori problems from a posteriori problems. They rest on views about the roots of logical necessity. They rest about views on meaning, and it's rather what shall we say, unsystematic nature. So, all of this rests on controversial philosophical views. Now, these views, should be supported by using and hence by relying on certain philosophical methods. Hence, arguments in favor of a certain conception of philosophy appear either question-begging or circular. They either take a certain way of philosophizing for granted, or they use their chosen method for validating philosophical views, which in turn vindicate these methods. This is where, what I call the myth of mere method comes in, the idea that the threat of circularity notwithstanding, many philosophical revolutionaries, Descartes is perhaps the prime culprit, but I think Husserl and the early Wittgenstein are equally in the dock, have succumbed to the illusion that one can fashion philosophical methods in a presuppositionless manner. They dream of a canonical method which does not in turn draw on philosophical views about knowledge, rationality, mental properties, logical necessity, linguistic meaning, or indeed the nature of philosophical problems. Here are a few, people who I think succumb to this myth. And at the end of the day, I think we have a Baron Munchausen idea here, because none of this works, even if you think the nature of philosophical problems dictate a certain method, then I think you are wrong. I will, and this is another typo, but I'll leave that. Wittgenstein thought there was a way out. He thought, well, look, philosophy just deals with a certain range of problems, and the problems dictate the methods. So for the aim of philosophy, for Wittgenstein, the aim of philosophy is to deal with problems of a distinctive, in his view, conceptual kind. For philosophy isn't anything except philosophical problems, the particular individual worries that we call philosophical problems. What is your aim in philosophy? To show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. So, if there's a fly, you want to rescue it, there may be several methods you can use, but, throwing the bottle into the oven certainly isn't one of them, right? So, your choice of options is restricted. If the nature of the philosophical problems were settled, one could rationally and without any special threat of circularity argue about the best way of tackling them. But even if there were a settled list of philosophical questions, and Wittgenstein's list is rather short, the nature of the problems they express would still be contestable. You wouldn't have escaped a philosophical controversy in this fashion. Second remedy, a former teacher of mine, Ernst Tugendhat, developed this out of Aristotle's metaphysics. Philosophizing is a label we attach to a particularly worthy intellectual pursuit. It's an honorific title. It's the intellectual activity we have most reason to engage in. I mean, he derives this in a very educated, scholarly manner out of Aristotle. Now, by this light, the proper conception of philosophy can be developed by first finding out what problems matter most. I mean, Aristotle thought it was theoretical reflection about the ultimate principles of reality. Tugendhat thinks it's the more Kantian question of what we have most reason to do. But in any event, you start out with the idea, which are the most important questions, and philosophy is just simply the activity which helps us coming to terms with these. Now, that would resolve the residual difficulty of identifying what problems should occupy philosophy. But, it seems, in my view, unfortunately, it's pie in the sky, because what problems matter most depend on the individual thinker and or her cultural tradition. And, it is itself subject to philosophical debate. And that debate is utterly, how shall we say, incommensurable. I mean, the debate between an Aristotelian who thinks that theoretical reflection is the most important thing in life, and a Kantian who thinks it's the question, what ought I to do? Well, it will end in a cul-de-sac. Okay. So if we do meta-philosophy, and I've been doing perhaps too much of it already, we should do so without illusions. We can no more settle methodological issues in advance of philosophizing than Hegel's Scholasticus could learn how to swim without getting wet. You're just simply stuck. You need to get on with it. One cannot address philosophical problems without doing philosophy, and hence without philosophical arguments and commitments of one's own. What one can do is ensure consistency between the methods on the one hand and one's metaphilosophical and philosophical or substantive views, and argue for the latter, these substantive views, in as clear, plausible, and unassuming way as possible. Now, oops, I'm already rather out of time, but I will, of course, not withhold or hold back on the analytic continental split. So here, but I will try to be as brief as possible. So this advice, make sure things cohere, and try to argue for your philosophical views in a manner that is as unassuming as possible, does provide guidelines for debates between methodologically diverse factions within analytic philosophy. But we are, I'm going to dwell on this. But can we also approach the analytic continental split in this fashion, or does that particular controversy reach deeper? Now, what is analytic philosophy? I'll just give you my view. I've argued for it ad nauseum in books and articles. It's a loose movement within 20th century Western philosophy, and it is held together both by ties of influence. I mean, Russell taught Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein influenced the Oxford ordinary language philosophers. Quine was annoyed by the Oxford ordinary language philosophers. Anscombe developed Wittgenstein's ideas, and so on, and also by various family resemblances. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I'll contrast. I mean, my idea of analytic philosophy is in many respects similar to the one that Chase and Reynolds then developed for continental philosophy. In their analytic and continental, they reject both what they call essentialist and deflationist approaches to continental philosophy. According to essentialism, there are defining features of the analytic and the continental movements that are mutually exclusive. And that does not leave any room for rapprochement, they complain. And according to deflationist approaches, the difference is apparent or negligible. It has already been overcome or can easily be overcome. And this, they hold, I think quite rightly, that this ignores the institutional reality of the split and fails to explain the mutual philosophical repudiation of that, that occurs, and name telling that does continue to occur on both sides. Okay, so they have a methodological conception of the divide. They try to avoid both of these options, essentialism and deflationism, by proposing a methodological conception. So, they also talk about family resemblances, but they focus on family resemblances concerning methodological recipes. And they think that this acknowledges the differences while holding the promise for an illuminating debate. And eventually, they aim at a kind of they aim, like many have done, at a synthesis of post-analytic, that's quite common, or meta-continental philosophy. I'm not sure I would, like meta-continental. I mean, too much of a good thing. Anyway, so here are a few methodological recipes that are supposed to characterize continental philosophy: a wariness of common sense, a temporal turn to the historical dimension of human life, an interest in intersubjectivity, an anti-representationalist account of the mind, transcendental reasoning, a concern with the relation between content and style, a critical attitude towards science, an anti-theoretical attitude towards ethico-political matters. Now, I think all of that is wrong. I mean, as a way of distinguishing analytic and from continental philosophy, it's wrong. Either it doesn't hold for paradigmatic continental philosophers, or it holds of paradigmatic analytic philosophers, or both. So I'm not going to go through that. You'll be relieved to hear. But instead, I think we should just refrain from, well, we should, abandon those specific suggestions, but, perhaps try to develop the idea that we are dealing with contrasting families or methods in a different manner. So these are unsuitable. In my view, if there is a single feature that divides the two, independently of separate historical traditions, it is more fundamental than the methodological recipes that Chase and Reynolds identify. It is a matter of style rather than method. It's a way of going about it. And style is an even more fundamental, I think, feature than method, although the two, of course, are connected. And I'll just cut this short. What separates analytic philosophy is not more or less specific procedures. Transcendental arguments are all over the place in analytic philosophy, but a more general style of thinking and writing. It revolves around certain intellectual aims, such as the striving for clarity and the reliance on rational argument. As Herbert Feigl once nicely said, analytic philosophy revolves around two humble questions. What do you mean? And how do you know? Now, I can't imagine, the left bank intellectuals in Paris, running around boasting of concerning themselves with that sort of, way of thinking. Okay. Now, finally, I won't cover my last part for reasons of time. I may do so if there's interest in the Q&A. So
you still got 10 minutes.
Oh, really?
So there is some time if you want to.
Okay. Okay. Oh, this is the alarm clock. My alarm clock must be going wrong. Anyway, okay, fine. All right, in that case, I'll give it to you. You'll regret this, Carlo. But anyway, so is the continental analytic split nobody's fault, but mine. I would say no. Insofar as there is a single feature separating analytic and continental philosophy, and I'm very skeptical about there being a single feature, but insofar as there is a single feature, it is a matter of intellectual style rather than topics, doctrines, or methods. The analytic side sets or purports to set greater store by clarity of exposition and rigor of argument. Now, on that assumption, right, you know, or at least I should have said on those two assumptions, namely insofar as there is a single feature separating the two, and insofar as it is the analytic side setting greater store by clarity and rigor of argument, on those two assumptions, the analytic continental split is not a showcase of faultless disagreement. Why not? Well, first of all, the divide separates the pursuit of different activities rather than logically incompatible claims. So it is not a case of disagreement, strictly speaking. I mean, you can, you know, easily identify points of agreement between analytic relativists or contextualists and continental thinkers, or, you know, of the, I mean, you know, analytic Nietzscheans and continental Nietzscheans, you know, as far as doctrines are concerned, they are, you know, on the same page. So it's not strictly speaking disagreeing over the truth or falsehood of a certain claim. Now, for another, and that's the point which, you know, I will not pursue any further, but if we are talking about a matter of style, and if we are talking about a question of style in addressing certain problems or problems of a certain type, which the Western philosophical and scientific tradition has bequeathed to us, then it seems to me clarity and rigor are pro tanto desirable. And so the side which shuns these intellectual virtues is at fault. I emphasize pro tanto, right? I think analytic philosophy is completely marred by an agonistic and aggressive, you know, demeanor in many regards. But and perhaps the pursuit of clarity and rigor can encourage this. But nevertheless, clarity and rigor per se are pro tanto desirable, and therefore it seems to me to lay, you know, to lay my cards on the table. It seems to me that in that kind of conflict, it's the continental side that's at fault. Now, so that's my preliminary conclusion, but I want to explore a different option. Perhaps we can reconceive the analytic continental divide as an instance of faultless divergence rather than disagreement in a narrow sense. The two strands or traditions pursue different activities, to be sure, but they are activities in pursuit of distinct goals, and these distinct goals could be both could be legitimate. And this might also be a way of accounting for the plurality of world philosophies in a non-antagonistic manner. But, you know, I'm not going to, if it doesn't work for analytic continental, I think it will definitely not work for, you know, other types of philosophy, with one exception. I think there are parts of Indian philosophy and linguistics which are very close to analytic philosophy. I think closer than much continental philosophy, but I shouldn't be saying this because I haven't got the background knowledge to back it up. Now, in order to consider the idea that there may be divergence here, but not disagreement, I will consider a distinction between two types of disagreement. This is not my distinction, but I found it congenial. It's belief versus action disagreement. So belief disagreement is disagreement over the truth of a claim. Is the claim or belief that P true or not? Is it true that philosophy 101 is more difficult than economics 101, for instance? And there is action disagreement. What should I do? Should I, prepare a vegan version of a Swabian roast or not? Our children say not, but anyway. So this is action disagreement. What should I or what should we do? Now, divergences between fundamentally different currents in Western philosophy and between Western and non-Western philosophy might be forms of action disagreement. They concern questions like, what kind of intellectual activity should we, should academic institutions, should societies, etc., engage in? So is all hunky-dory on that front? Well, in the first instance, yes. In many cases, one can both phi and psi. I can prepare both a vegan and a non-vegan version of this dish. I can go running and swimming and cycling, actually, as some of you may know. There's no incompatibility here. I don't have to choose. Even a single subject A can, phi and psi at the same time. Certain things I do of writing a certain text may be engaging both in empirical speculation and conceptual clarification, for instance. And of course, this holds even more for groups and institutions over an extended period of time. There's absolutely no reason, why one and the same institution, a philosophy department, for instance, or an NGO should not do many different things over an extended period of time. And why shouldn't we engage in all of the activities that have been called philosophizing? So, taking a leaf out of Karl Marx's book, Analytic philosophy in the morning, Continental philosophy around lunchtime, Indian philosophy in the afternoon, traditional philosophy or history of ideas after dinner. I think you should do history of ideas after dinner because, to be perfectly frank, it's easiest. So this might be a way out, but there are two obstacles. One is, oh God, conflicting reasons. Now, in our case, phi and psiing are, we are interested in cases of phi and psiing as activities which are done for a reason. These are not just any types of activities, but these are what some people call, I think, misleadingly intentional actions. They are done for reasons, and these reasons can be incompatible. So this possibility obviously arises for intellectual activities. Reasons for destroying your opponent in heuristic argument are incompatible with reasons for identifying the basics of rational argument or the basics of reaching consensus. I think that's an insight, incidentally, of Jürgen Habermas, right? So certain reasons you may have for a certain way of pursuing a debate are incompatible with certain reasons you have for sticking to underlying principles of rational argument. But, philosophical activities needn't be incompatible. So reasons for engaging in conceptual analysis are compatible with engaging in conceptual engineering. And one can be interested in the kinds of problems Wittgenstein tried to resolve, and both in that kind of problem and in producing more or less systematic reflection on the human condition, which is the take on continental philosophy by another teacher of mine, Peter Strawson. Okay, so, you can do both of these things. Why not? Second obstacle, let's come back to the idea of philosophy as the supreme activity. if Aristotle and Tugendhat are right, then we would have at least to prioritize certain intellectual activities over others. Yeah, musing about human existence or may be fine, but it's not as important as thinking about the ultimate components of reality, if Aristotle is to be trusted. But as I mentioned, the idea of a single context-independent hierarchy of intellectual activities is at the very least highly controversial. I think it's wrong, but I haven't given you the argument for that conclusion, and this is where I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I hope, of course, you can't hear the applause, but there is one. Okay, so now we're going to take a 5 minutes break. The Q&A will work as usual, so you can either type your question down or raise a hand, write question to ask it directly. If you want to start writing your question now, feel free to do it.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry?
No, just for my benefit, because yesterday I was in an MS Teams session for 6 hours, and I get confused by these things. Is there now the chat in Zoom? I mean, will I be able to read the questions from the chat?
Yes, you will be able to read it from the chat, but we're going to read it out loud anyway.
Okay, fine.
So
yeah.
Okay, so we will resume at 2:30.
Thank you for the talk. So I was slightly puzzled by your kind of opening statement that you don't want to engage with the question of whether there is a Western philosophical tradition to begin with. But my question is more about why you had to make that move to get to where you wanted to get by the end of your talk. So I was wondering if it had to do with the fact that you think there's a shared, roughly kind of a shared history and maybe roughly shared subject matter between the Continental and Analytic traditions, which is what kind of motivates not challenging the idea of the West as far as philosophical traditions go, or if there's something else I missed, because I just wasn't sure about why you had to make that move, because if anything, it seems to point to further kind of assumptions that might be worth unpacking.
I think you are still muted, so we can't hear you.
Good. Yes, as one of my postgraduate students has said, "You're still muted" is the sentence of the year. Yeah, I made that move partly because I read the abstracts of another keynote, and I know that categories like Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, African philosophy are hotly contested, both by those who think there's no such thing and by those who think there is such thing. And there's quite a debate about it, and I'm not qualified to participate in the details of that debate. So that's part of the explanation. I use the term Western philosophy at several junctures, and I use it first of all when I compare philosophy with science. This is confined to Western philosophy, and that's why I use the label. And so, since I know that for some participants in this conference, these labels are contestable or contested, and since I am well aware of the fact that most distinctions buckle under pressure, I try to just bracket that topic. I mean, for instance, yeah, so just to I mean, it's quite clear that what we call the Western philosophical tradition has very important interactions with Islamic philosophy, just to start with, and to what extent you can align the kind of semantic, logical, epistemological and metaphysical reflection you find in Greek philosophy, in medieval philosophy and analytic philosophy to currents in Indian philosophy is also, highly contested. So I just wanted to, cover my back.
If you want to have a short reply, Leah, you can.
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could reply to that, but I think just a couple of points. I mean, first of all, the idea that the science is a Western phenomenon is extremely contested and has been refuted quite convincingly by philosophers of science, including people who are experts on history of Western science, so to speak. And I mean, math, as well as we know, was very importantly developed in Babylonia, Egypt, India. We wouldn't have the number 0, of course, without India. But I mean, those are just anecdotal examples. And the fact that the Greeks were kind of the inventors of science is, of course, quite dubious as well. But I mean, what I struggle to see here is why not kind of think about what the West assumes as a point of continuity within kind of the subject matter that's roughly identified as such, because if anything, that's the kind of construct that we haven't actually thought about. So there's a legitimacy debate about India, China, Latin American philosophy, et cetera, but we never actually stop and think about what the Western so-called philosophical tradition is about. And if anything, I think it's extremely relevant to a debate about analytic and continental philosophy. And not addressing that seems to kind of miss a big part of what's going on here. But I mean, yeah, I think
I need to come back on that, because on the one hand, what you've just said confirms my suspicion that the cautionary note I started out with is necessary, because basically what you're pointing out is that I should have added a cautionary note about the label science as well. I mean, when I was, this is a lapse, but I promise you, I am fully aware of the fact that what we nowadays call science has very different roots, and that there are, different traditions that might lay equal claim to that label. So I should have spoken more cautiously about, in my comparing philosophy and science, I was sticking to Western philosophy and Western science, and that makes it all the more important to recognize that these categorizations are themselves contested. So that's one point where I just say, I think what you've just said is grist to the mill of making such a cautionary note. On another point, I strongly disagree with you. You said we never bothered to talk about what Western philosophy is about. I'm terribly sorry, but ever since Aristotle and Kant, there have been people who have been, and Wittgenstein, and in the current craze in metaphilosophy, there are people who've done, precisely that. But, they haven't acknowledged or noted other traditions, but it's simply wrong to say that Western philosophy has not thought about what it's all about. That's simply wrong.
Okay. Yeah, I know, Leah, you will surely like to reply, but we have other questions. I hope there will be a chance to kind of say something more also later on, because you're both on the panel anyway. So we're going to have some possibilities. So next question is from Eri. She brought down one, so I'm going to read it out loud. Thanking you for the talk. Just a point of clarification. So if I have understood you right, the distinctions between analytic and continental are more to do with subject matter and attitude. To do either well, you need decent ways of thinking. This is where I think we could do no better than Wittgenstein to help us, but I may be biased. Mm-hmm. This is how.
Okay, well, thank you. I thought that I had, I think one thing is very clear. You can't have a neat distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. I said, if there is a single feature distinguishing the two, then it is a matter of style rather than topic or a doctrine or method. And so I think I would not accept the description that it has more to do with subject matter, but I think you are right that it may have something to do with attitude. And you are right that when I said style, I might have said attitude. And a certain style of thinking and speaking and discussing evinces a certain attitude. I think a certain way of thinking and debating should, should be decent. I mean, I think it should pay heed to ethical considerations widely understood. I think that's not the only parameter by which a way of discussing and thinking can be judged, but it certainly is a crucial one. So I would agree with that, but I would add that conducting a decent discussion, and if decent doesn't just simply stand for a good discussion, conducting a decent discussion may not always solve the problems, and you may have you need other intellectual virtues. And then you say this is where I think we could do no better than Wittgenstein to help us, but I may be biased. Well, not so sure about that. I think Wittgenstein was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. He certainly enriched my life immensely. But if you're thinking about the way he himself debated or didn't debate, then I would hope that one can do better. I mean, Wittgenstein was famous for not brooking dissent. And on the occasions when he was challenged by, when he was challenged by people who were not just his intellectual equals, and I think Elizabeth Anscombe and Georg Henrik von Wright were certainly his intellectual equals, but by intellectual equals who had different outlooks, like Ramsey or Turing, he got pretty stroppy. Not to mention Carnap. So I'm not sure that I would say that Wittgenstein as a person is a shining example. But it is certainly true that Wittgenstein was one of the people who alerted us to the fact that philosophizing isn't just a neat little knack that one can acquire by studying PPE, and that it matters in what spirit it is conducted. So to that I would consent.
Okay, next question. We have Nick.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the talk. I found it quite interesting too. So my question is about your idea that if you already assume, and you're skeptical about it, but if you already assume that what separates Continental and Analytic philosophy is, excuse me, clarity and rigor being more prized by Analytic philosophy, then under that assumption, Analytic philosophy is superior, or Continental philosophy is at fault for not doing so, if I understood you correctly.
Yes.
I wanted to say that I don't think even in that couched example that you can go that far, because it seems to me that clarity and rigor are on a sort of a spectrum of defeasibility. So you have a certain focus on clarity or rigor to a certain defeasible scale, and I am certainly, I think, in agreement that Analytic philosophy tends to make that scale a higher bar to meet. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that makes it better per se, even, because basically what you end up with is the higher the defeasibility of your clarity and rigor that's required, the lower your scope of the philosophical essay can be, because you end up having to spend so much extra time and philosophical argument defending each point. And I think that is represented reasonably well in like at least the overall perception of analytic philosophy and Continental, even though you can find, as you said, examples in both that do both, in that Continental philosophy tends to have a wider scope and more political focus and so on, partly because they aren't expected to have an extremely high defeasible level of rigor and clarity in every single point, and that is a detriment in analytic philosophy, that it makes it much, much harder to start these larger scale, bigger picture and cross-topical discussions, and that's just a trade-off. And in that respect, that makes it back to a blameless disagreement, in as much as clarity and rigor is something that they prize, but it isn't the only thing that needs to be prized.
Thank you. I would certainly agree with the idea that clarity and rigor, well, defeasible. I think clarity and rigor are not static and individual merits of a piece of philosophizing. They emerge in the way in which you interact with questions, objections, elaborations. So while I do think there is such a thing as a clearly written text, setting out topic, questions, claims, arguments, loose ends. I mean, the sort of thing I tell people when they write a grant proposal or an article. Whether your assumptions stand up, whether your concepts are all clear, that ultimately has to come out in the way in which you answer questions of clarification, for instance, or challenges. So it is not a static virtue. I also think that it is a virtue that allows of degrees. Now, I would dispute the idea that given all these caveats, which of course apply to scope of reflection just as much, I would dispute that there is necessarily a trade-off between scope and clarity, that it's a zero-sum game. I also don't think that analytic philosophy has a narrower scope than Continental philosophy. I mean, I think that analytic philosophy tended in its at its beginnings to focus on logic and philosophy of language and metaphysics, but it soon widened into all manner of reflections. I mean, ethical, political, aesthetic, the meaning of life. I mean, you name it, it's all there. And I just think that, I mean, take the philosophy of animal minds, which is one of my hobbies. No, it's not. It's one of my areas of work. And I think the questions that analytic philosophers have raised in this regard, whether they be Davidson or Dennett or Fodor or various perhaps less famous people who are currently working on this, or Tyler Birch, are not less general than the reflections by Derrida, and yet I think they're a lot clearer. L'animal que donc je suis, and it is even clearer in reflections on animal welfare and animal ethics, which which you get from the Continental side. So, yeah, but I agree with you that these are, first of all, these are not the only parameters, and that they are context dependent and not static. But where I would disagree is one, I don't think there's a necessary trade-off. I think you can write on highly general issues in a beautifully lucid style. I think Ryle and Peter Strawson come to mind in areas which are close to my heart. And I think by and large, the analytic side does better.
Okay, thanks. I think I'll probably return to this in the panel. Lots of other questions, but thanks very much.
Good. So next we have Anna. Question as well.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about something you said on one of your slides, and you said that like external philosophical investigations are often or sometimes philosophically barren.
Yes.
And in some respects, like I can think of several cases where I would think that is probably quite true. But I was wondering what you think about the following. Like, so I think that there can be certain philosophizing philosophy, like meta philosophy about philosophy, that will be called not philosophy by certain, traditional views by people who hold some, traditional, like orthodox, maybe analytical comes to mind, like views about philosophy and have something to say about what philosophy is within philosophy as it is currently. And I think that sometimes that's unfair and wrong, that like that assessment is made. And there's like a paper by Christy Dodson, for example, it's called How is this paper philosophy, where she asks questions like that. And I find that it's like really interesting question, because I wonder if how do we avoid by like when we say something like that, like certain philosophical investigations about philosophy are philosophically barren and don't really consider the way philosophy works and what it does and the practices we have. But how do we avoid making the claim about certain things that might at first seem strange to us or not philosophy to us, the way in which we've been philosophically socialized? But it actually raises very important points about mispractices, for example, in philosophy, and harmful exclusionary tendencies in philosophy. And like, I wonder what you think about whether that is even possible in the current philosophy that we have, or like in the spirit of the conference title, do we need more radical rethinking of this? So that's my question.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I was thinking of sociology of knowledge in particular. I was also thinking of various psychoanalytic approaches to philosophy. I mean, it's been forgotten, but whereas I think reflection on the nature of philosophy has been ripe since Aristotle, the label metaphilosophy derives from Morris Lazarowitz, who was a pupil of Wittgenstein's, and he was, the husband of Alice Ambrose, another important pupil of Wittgenstein's. And he thought that metaphilosophy is a non-philosophical understanding of philosophy, which makes intelligible how people could go around asking and trying to answer these questions by reference to psychoanalysis. And that I find barren. I also find barren the question of the extent, philosophically barren, the extent to which, I don't know what, the obsession with Gettier examples was driven by certain currents within the North American, tertiary education sector, right? I mean, that's all, barren. I find it philosophically barren. But you're quite right that there are other considerations which, do at least give rise to certain philosophical questions. I mean, I think one of the reasons why analytic philosophy has been so successful is that it exudes an air of professionalism and technical competence, and now we've really learned something, right? I mean, You know, that's often something students have told me after I have given, you know, when I had finished my introduction to a formal logic course at Reading, that they were sort of, you know, satisfied that now they had grasped, you know, a tool. And I hardly dared telling them that, you know, if they ever attended my third year Wittgenstein class, I tell them that a lot of this is spurious. But, you know, so the idea, the connection, for instance, between things done in analytic philosophy and this air of professionalism, of technical competence, also the connection between analytic philosophy and its roots in Greek philosophy, which was, you know, and the Greek culture was very competitive and very, you know, in that sense also very agonistic. That this may, you know, influence a certain way of debating, way of conducting analytic philosophy. That is interesting, not because it is itself philosophy, but because it gives rise to, you know, to philosophical problems. Is this ideal of rational argument, which I really set store by, is that committed to an antagonistic competitive paradigm, or does it not presume also a consensual framework for joint commitment to truth and so on? So these things do raise very interesting philosophical problems, but the sociological considerations themselves are, in my view, not philosophical. I mean, you know, they give rise to philosophical problems, and in order to engage in them, you need to know philosophy, but, you know, it's not the same as doing philosophy.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is being written down by Howlin. So the question is basically asking for a clarification on the notion of style. So the confusion was that centrally it doesn't refer to a cluster of methods or a paradigm in Thomas Kuhn's sense, but then what does it refer to?
Okay, well, I mean, thank you. I realize that I have not really been as clear as I might have been, but, you know, on one point I hope to have been clear, namely, I quite agree that it's not a matter of simply a cluster of methods or paradigms. You can, you know, I mean, I think the methods employed in modal metaphysics, for instance, or in applied philosophy, in conceptual analysis a la Strawson, or in, well, what should I call it? Or the sorts of thing Tyler Birch does on origins of objectivity, or the sorts of things that Iris Murdoch and Philippa Foot and Elizabeth Anscombe do. You know, these are different methods. Describing them is sometimes difficult. So it has to be something more basic than that. And I tried to say it's a matter of intellectual style. I mean, I don't mean style of writing, although there's a very close connection between, you know, striving for clarity and striving for a clear linguistic expression of your ideas. And it's it is just first have a, you know, once you've identified something that interests you, try to understand what precisely the topic is, try to formulate cogent and distinct questions about it, and try to consider the possibility that some of those questions may themselves already be loaded, that they may, you know, contain assumptions, or, you know, make assumptions which are themselves contested. So that's why I quite like this, you know, Herbert Feigel's, you know, it's all a matter of asking two questions: what do you mean, and how do you know? Of course, as I said, this is a very general recipe, but I think that's something which I would say is in play, whether it's Birch's Origins of Objectivity, or Anscombe's Intentions, or Wittgenstein's remarks on the foundations of mathematics.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. We have a comment by Elise, but she's telling it not to read it out loud. It's about the discussion you were having before with Leah, and I invited everyone to read it. And maybe I hope we're going to be able to go back to that during the panel. So the next question is by Ixch. The question is like, we now know that the analytic continental divide is at least partly due to different interpretations of specific philosophers in the history of philosophy, notably Kant, Marburg School, Southwest School. I was wondering if we can get around, to a limited extent, the circularity problem in this way, by tracking back to interpretations of great philosophers recognized by both sides. At least the two sides would have some common vocabularies and methodological assumptions to go on.
Yeah, that's a nice idea, and it would suggest that, I mean, it's one of the ways in which substantive philosophy, although it doesn't essentially require knowledge of the history of philosophy, can profit from knowing the history of philosophy. However, I am a bit reluctant. This was this idea that, you know, the analytic continental philosophy divide. This is Michael Freeman, isn't it? That, you know, it was partly started at a 2-week seminar in Davos when Carnap and Cassirer and Heidegger, you know, discussed matters. I'm not sure I buy that, or rather, I'm pretty sure I don't buy that. I also don't think that analytic philosophy essentially derives from Kant. Well, I mean, Kant bequeaths a lot of problems to the whole Western tradition. But I'm not sure that one can simply go back to different interpretations of Kant to sort things out. I mean, I've been interested in Kant scholarship, in particular in the analytic Kantianism, which derives from Strawson. I can see, I mean, I was present when Strawson and Allison debated transcendental idealism, and that was partly fruitful. But, you know, I can't see that Strawson and Foucault could debate Kant very profitably, to tell you the truth, because, you know, Strawson would simply not be interested in all these sort of sociological and cultural reflections, and Foucault would think that Strawson was nitpicking and getting lost in details. But, you know, I mean, having said that, certainly it is one way of getting a discussion started, but one has to be a bit more specific. Incidentally, I don't think a Marburg School versus Southwest School will necessarily work, because insofar as Frege was influenced by any kind of neo-Kantianism, and that's itself contested, it was the Southwest School of Windelband and Rickert, and insofar people like Carnap and Reichenbach were influenced by Kantianism, it was by the Marburg School and the idea of philosophy as meta-science. But yeah, I mean, going back, it is certainly true, and that I'll stop after that. It's certainly true that if analytic and continental philosophy go back to certain towering figures, the last one they can probably agree on would be Kant. Certainly not Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, or Marx, or yeah, also not Bolzano or Brentano on the other side.
Okay, we are 3 minutes over time, so we're going to need to add this Q&A session. Thank you, Professor Glock, and thank you to everyone for the great questions. There are some comments, so I invite you everyone to read them out loud. Not out loud, but read them. And I'll see you in, let's say, 3 minutes to recover a little bit.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, and apologies for running over.